Hello! So I'm back, and this time I want to introduce to you the Gamemaster Model, probably my favorite model of them all. And in every coaching conversation that I engage in, I use the Gamemaster Model as a framework. And I suggest that you try and do the same with the Gamemaster Model. And that's why I will introduce it in detail. I will talk a bit about where it comes from, and I will talk about how it can be used, and I will try and give some practical examples as well. So, the Gamemaster Model, let's move back 70 years to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was from Austria. He was a teacher and he was also a philosopher, and one of his key concepts was that every time we engage with other people, we play by language games. Language games. So what he proposes is that whenever we communicate, we play a language game. Now, language games, they determine what we can talk about, and they also determine what we can't really talk about. So the language games are pretty central to how communication unfolds. So we need to pay attention to the language games that we're in order to also set new boundaries and rules for the language games that we need to play in order to succeed. And in coaching, we need to move forward from Wittgenstein 20-30 years to Pearce and Cronen, because they took the notion of language game and they turned it into the Gamemaster Model. Because they said that in every communication aspect, when we play the language game, then there's a game master and there's a game player. Now the game master, he knows the language game, but he can also change the rules for the language game. The game player knows the rules and just play along with the rules set by the language game. And they make the central distinction between two levels in each communicative process, where they say that there is always a process level and a content level. And at the content level is where communication just unfolds by the rules of the game. So here is where we will talk about whatever we would be talking about, but we would be following the rules of the language game. It's not even sure that we are aware of the fact that we're playing a language game, because we would just engage in communication, we would talk, we would answer questions, we would ask questions, and we would just go along with the communication. This is also the level of communication that the game player engages in. So the game player just plays the language game at the content level, just going along as the communication unfolds. The game master also knows this level and recognizes the rules that this level follows. But the game master is also aware of the process level. And the process level is a meta level where we can both engage in the content level, but we can also discover and renegotiate the rules by which the content level follows. So at the process level, we are aware of the fact that we play communication by rules, but we are also very much engaged in setting the rules for the language game. And let's talk about coaching. In coaching, this notion of a process level and a content level is very central in establishing the coaching framework for the conversation. And as you have perhaps guessed already, being a coach is very much about being a game player or game master. Game master. And the better the game master that we can be, the easier it is for our coachees to just engage in their own reflections doing all of the important reflection work that they need to do on a content level in order to succeed and in order to find new meaningful ways to move forward with their problems or dilemmas or whatever they want to reflect on. Now, in coaching, the first thing that we will do with the Gamemaster model is establish a contract. So the first thing we do in a coaching conversation is to make a contract. And the contract is all about setting the rules for the communication game that we're going to play in the coaching. So what we're going to talk about in the contract is time. We're also going to talk about purpose. And the last thing we would also like to talk about in the contracting is roles. So whenever I open a conversation, a coaching conversation, just 2 hours ago I was sitting right there actually having a coaching conversation with the leader. And the first thing I ask is the purpose of the conversation. So, Ingrid, could be her name. So, Ingrid, we have 1 hour for this conversation, and what would you like to be the outcome or the purpose of this conversation? So, the first thing I want her to reflect on is exactly what she wants out of this conversation. So I begin with the ending. If this is time, I want her to reflect on how we use the time in the most productive way in order to help her in the best possible way. And I do that by asking, what purpose do you want for this conversation? So she said perhaps something similar like, well, I really want to reflect on how I can be a firm leader, I can set clear directions, but also be very inclusive and involve my employees in the important questions that we need to answer in a common way to move forward. Okay, and I would stay perhaps a bit curious and ask her some more questions about what does that mean? How does that look like? And then I would sum it up by perhaps asking her, okay, so just to sum it up, please explain to me, what exactly would you like to take away from our session? And then she said, I would love to go away from this session with a clear picture on how I can involve my employees, but still keep some sort of sense of direction. Be a clear leader as well. And we're still making the contract. And the last thing I ask her is regarding the roles of this conversation, this particular language game. So I ask her, okay, so if that's what you want to take away from this session, what role should I play? How can I help you in the best possible way? And then she said something like, well, I need you to be very curious, but I also need you to provoke me a little bit. Okay, provoke, what does that mean? Well, sometimes you ask me just those questions that at first I get a bit annoyed, but then I reflect and then that I see that it's actually really helpful when you provoke me a little bit. Okay, so by asking that, I get a lot of insights on how I can be the best possible help, the best possible coach in this particular coaching conversation. And by asking these questions, I'm establishing a common goal. I'm establishing some sort of common picture on what we should take away from this session. But I also get valuable insights on how I should be a coach in order to help her in the best possible way. And she also says aloud exactly what it is that she wants, hereby being more attentive and hereby focusing more on what she really needs to take away. So the contract is typically perhaps 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 2 minutes. But I always begin by making a contract, because then we have something that we can both focus on as we go along the way in the coaching conversation. And the reason why I put it up here on the process level is because by asking the questions that I just mentioned, we're also establishing the rules of the language game. So when I start asking questions, when she starts reflecting on her own practice, on the content level, we have established some ground rules to do it from. And then the coaching conversation moves along. I ask a lot of questions. She's doing a lot of reflection work. And then at some point, she's beginning to talk about something that happened perhaps 10 years ago. And I'm getting the feeling that what she's talking about right now is perhaps not relevant to our contract. What she's talking about right now is perhaps putting the wrong focus, is perhaps not as relevant to her as what we could be talking about instead. And because we've already made the contract, it enables me to do a so-called timeout. I just pause the conversation and I'm just being transparent about what I am experiencing right now. So Ingrid, now I hear that you're including some experiences that happened 15 years ago. Please help me. How's that relevant to what you want to take away from this session? How's this relevant in your reflection work about being a more clear and directive leader, a strategically aware leader that also wants to involve and take into account the voices of your employees? And then perhaps she says, oh yeah, well, I'm not really sure. Perhaps it isn't that relevant. And then we just move back to what we were talking about. But perhaps it was also relevant to talk about some experiences that happened 10 years ago. And then obviously it's not a problem, but I just want to make sure that we're always staying on a relevant path. And the timeout enables that kind of reflection. And it's not that I want, as a coach, to be too directive in what we can talk about and what we cannot talk about. But our role as coaches is to always make sure that we're talking about what is the most important thing to talk about right now for our coachees. And our role as a game master is to make sure that we're always staying on a very relevant path in order to make that happen. So whenever we feel that we're talking about something that is not really that important, or perhaps it's better to talk about that for another time, or perhaps we should park it and then return to it on a later stage, all these questions are made relevant by the timeout. So the timeout is a tool in the Gamemaster model that we apply to always make sure that we're talking about the most relevant thing in relation to what they want to take away from the coaching session. And if you guys were to coach me, I always have a lot of thoughts in my head, especially when I'm being coached. So you would probably experience, if you coached me, that let's say I was talking about how to optimize my web page, and then suddenly I began to talk about what new car should I buy? Should I buy a car? Do I really need a car? And then you would sense that this coaching conversation is perhaps being sidetracked. Now we're talking about something that is not really relevant to what was the most important thing for me to talk about. And then you would use this particular, I'm just running out of, it should be okay. And then you would realize that it would probably be a good idea to do a timeout and ask me, okay, Jacob, so now you're talking about your car. Could you please explain, or not exactly explain, but please elaborate. How's that also relevant for the optimization of your web page? And then I would probably say something, oh yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if those things are even related. Let's return to talking about my web page. And then you would use the timeout to help me carefully get back on track with what is the most important thing for me to talk about, in this instance, my webpage. But we also need to use the timeouts as a flexible tool to be able to change direction in a coaching conversation. So perhaps I realized along the way that I'm talking about the optimization of my web page, but what I really should be talking about was my pipeline in 2021. And then you would just probably ask me using a timeout, okay, Jacob, so this pipeline, you've mentioned it twice now. Is it also important to spend some time on talking about that right now? Or should we stay on track with the web page optimization? So what makes sense to you, Jacob? And if I say, well, just thinking about it, I really feel that I should be paying more attention to my pipeline in 2021. So if it's all right with you, dear coach, I'd love to change the subject of this conversation and perhaps focus more on that. And then, of course, we just renegotiate the contract and we use the timeout to do that. And then we renegotiate a new contract. Okay, Jacob, so this pipeline in 2021, how do we best use the remaining 40 minutes to talk about that in a way that helps you? What are your new goal of this coaching session? And then I would perhaps say something like, well, I'd love it if I could get more systematical in my way of following up on leads, perhaps, and that's probably the most important thing for me to take away from this session. And then, that's a new contract. So as a game master, we want to be as flexible as possible in helping our coachees to reflect on how they reflect most efficiently on what they need to reflect on. Always being prepared to renegotiate the contract so that we can set the boundaries for their reflection work on what matters the most to them. So now, in my case, not Ingrid, now it's Jacob, we will be talking about the pipeline of 2021. You would ask a lot of great questions. You would ask a lot about what the future would look like, and you would make me reflect a lot. You would also perhaps bring in some of your personal experiences with building and maintaining a pipeline. And you would perhaps also make another timeout, just reassuring that we're on the right path for this conversation. And if you were coaching me, you would perhaps say something like, okay, Jacob, so now we have 15 minutes to go in this coaching session. So are we talking about your pipeline in a relevant way? And I would say, oh, yeah, sure. And perhaps you would elaborate on it and ask, okay, so Jacob, we've been talking for 45 minutes now. So far, what are the most important learnings that you have made about your pipeline? And I would say, oh, well, it's done. And then you would perhaps ask, okay, so we have 15 minutes left. How do we need to move forward in this coaching session to help you in the best possible way? And perhaps I would then say, well, I need you as a coach to perhaps provoke me a little bit. You need to help me keep my focus, keep me on track, keep me helping my discipline, because that's usually some of the things that I need to pay attention to in development work like this. And then you say, all right, perfect. And then we move along. And that takes us further to the last tool of the Gamemaster model, which is the evaluation. And I always suggest to actually set off a fair amount of time or prepare yourself for spending perhaps 5-10 minutes of the evaluation by the end of each coaching session. Because the evaluation has two central elements to it. One of them is to look at what have happened in the coaching conversation and following up on the important stuff that our coachees was reflecting about, leading to results. So that's one thing. We want to look back at what had been important of the reflection work of our coachees. So perhaps you would ask me something like, okay, Jacob, so now we have 5 minutes left and it's time to just wrap things up in a meaningful way. So please repeat to me, Jacob, what has been the most important things that you take away from this session so far? And I would reflect and I would say something like, well, being systematical is a very key aspect of building my pipeline. I also need some help, so I need a student assistant who can help me and assist me in this. I also realized that I need to set up a plan for my pipeline management. So I should be using at least 20 minutes each Monday of a new week, preparing myself for the pipeline work. And that's probably the most important takeaways from this session. Then you would perhaps follow up and always referring to the contract. Okay, so in the things you mentioned now, is there anything that is more important than the others to focus on right away? And I could reflect on that. So we use the evaluation to look back on what have happened in the conversation, and we use it as a way of helping our coachees to sum up what our takeaways are. So that's one aspect of the evaluation. Then we also want the evaluation to point in the direction of the future. So we also want the evaluation to be about our next steps. So Jacob, what would be a meaningful first step in your pipeline management? What do you need from other people? What do you need to do? So we need to make the next steps clear. So the evaluation points in that direction, but it also points in that direction. And then, when the time is more or less up, you have used the Gamemaster Model as a complete framework for how to begin a coaching conversation by establishing a contract that looks on what takeaways we need from this coaching session. We have also used as many timeouts as needed to renegotiate the contract, and always using timeouts to pay attention to what is the most important thing to talk and reflect about for our coachee. And we have talked about how the evaluation looks back on the whole conversation and is a way of talking about takeaways, both in the sense of what has already happened in this conversation, but also in terms of the next steps. The last important thing I always do in each coaching session is to evaluate my own role. And we have already introduced that question in the contract. What role should I play in order to help you best? Should I be kind of an expert? Should I be provocative? Should I be curious? Should I be asking a lot of questions? Should I perhaps bring forward a hypothesis or two? And we want to follow up by the end of each coaching conversation by asking similar questions, but just in an evaluative way. So I always end the coaching sessions by asking something like, okay, so of all the things that I did during this conversation, what was particularly helpful? And when we see each other again in a few weeks' time, what would you like me to keep doing? And what especially worked? And is there perhaps something you would like me to adjust a little? Should I be less or more provocative? Or in what way would you like me to perhaps adjust my role as a coach in order to help you in the best possible way? And that's the Gamemaster Model. And when you get acquainted to the Gamemaster Model, there are dozens of more perspectives and small finesses that we can work with. But the basic takeaway about the Gamemaster Model is that it works excellent as a framework for each coaching conversation. And once we distinguish between the content and the process level, then we can be the effective facilitator of our coachees' reflection work on content level. Simply because we're always able to renegotiate the contract, to set different boundaries for the language game that they're playing, and always making sure that what we're spending our time on in the coaching session is what is most relevant for our coachees. Okay, thanks for listening, and we will be working with this when we see each other Monday, and hopefully we can also do some demonstrations and live demonstrations and make a lot of nerdy common reflections on what goes on in the coaching conversation. And now we can use the Gamemaster Model as a way of talking about it. Thank you.